Welcome back to Revenge Room, the channel where betrayal meets justice and karma never forgets. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button because the story I'm about to share today will stay with you long after the video ends. Today's story is called During a Family Photo. My daughter-in-law, Sneered, move out of the picture, your face is ruining it. Picture this, a family gathering. Laughter in the air. Everyone gathers for a photo, a simple moment meant to capture love and togetherness. But instead, a daughter-in-law turns to her father-in-law and sneers, "Move out of the picture, your face is ruining it." The son, his own flesh and blood, laughs and adds, "Just step aside, Dad." The entire room erupts in laughter. Everyone laughing at him. He does not argue. He does not fight back. He simply steps out of the frame, walks to his car, and drives away in silence. That night, his phone buzzes with a text from his son. Just 3 words. She is still crying. But here is what they did not know. That humiliation was not the end of his story. It was the beginning. Because what happened next would unravel secrets buried for decades, expose a web of manipulation and greed, and deliver a reckoning that no one saw coming, not even the ones who thought they had already won. If you skip ahead or leave now, you will miss twists that will leave you speechless, and an ending that delivers pure, undeniable justice. Stay until the very last second. Trust me, this one is worth every minute. Now, let us begin. My name is Arthur Whitman. I am 67 years old, a retired corporate consultant who spent 35 years helping Fortune 500 companies navigate their darkest crises. My wife Margaret passed away 2 years ago, and since then I've lived quietly in the Denver home where we raised our only son, Daniel. I thought retirement would be peaceful. I thought family would be my comfort. I was wrong about both. The Sunday dinner at Daniel's house started like any other. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than it should have, and a hope that this visit might feel different from the last. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and someone's distant fireplace. I stood on the porch for a moment before ringing the bell, adjusting my collar, telling myself that today would be better. Lauren opened the door with that smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She had perfected it over the 8 years of her marriage to my son, a practiced expression that looked warm in photographs but felt cold up close. She kissed my cheek without touching me the way you might greet a distant relative you hoped would leave early. "Welcome, Dad," she said, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to pass as sincere. "Everyone is already here." I stepped inside and immediately understood what everyone meant. The Lawsons had arrived first. Richard and Melissa Lauren's parents sat in the best seats by the fireplace, drinks already in hand, comfortable in a way that suggested ownership rather than hospitality. Daniel stood near them laughing at something Richard had said, and when he saw me, his smile flickered for just a moment before resettling into place. "Hey, Dad," he called out, but he didn't move to greet me. He never did anymore. The living room walls told a story I had been trying to ignore for years. Family photographs covered nearly every surface, carefully arranged in expensive frames. I counted them once on a visit 3 years ago, 37 photos in this room alone. I appeared in 4 of them all from before Margaret died. The newer editions featured Lauren prominently, sometimes with Daniel, often with her parents, occasionally with friends I did not recognize. I had become a ghost in my own son's home, visible only in images from a past they seemed eager to forget. Dinner passed in the usual way. Melissa dominated the conversation with stories about their recent cruise. Richard offered unsolicited opinions about politics and investments. Lauren steered every topic back to herself, her achievements, her plans, her vision for the future. Daniel nodded along, agreeing with whoever spoke loudest. I ate quietly, answered when addressed, and tried not to notice how often my comments were interrupted or ignored. After dessert, Lauren announced that we should take a family photo. She had been planning it for weeks, she explained, and the light in the living room was perfect right now. She arranged everyone with the precision of a director staging a scene. Richard and Melissa in the center naturally, Daniel beside them. She positioned herself at the focal point, adjusting her hair in the reflection of a picture frame. Then she turned to me. "Stand over here, Dad," she said, gesturing to the far corner. "The light is better for you there." I moved to where she pointed, grateful to be included at all. The camera was set on a timer. Lauren made final adjustments, checked the angle twice, and then joined the group. Everyone smiled. The shutter clicked, and then Lauren said it. Actually, she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of casual cruelty that some people mistake for humor. "We should take another one. Without you in the frame, Dad, your face is kind of ruining the composition." The room went silent for one heartbeat. Then Daniel laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut deeper than anything Lauren had said. "Just step aside, Dad," he added. "It is not a big deal." Richard chuckled. Melissa covered her smile with her hand, and suddenly everyone was laughing, all of them at me, while I stood frozen in the corner of my own son's living room, still holding the pose for a photograph that had already rejected me. I did not argue. I did not demand an apology. I didn't ask my son how he could laugh at his own father. I simply lowered my arms, walked to the closet, retrieved my coat, and let myself out the front door. No one followed me. No one called my name. The laughter continued behind me, muffled by walls that felt thicker than they had ever been. I drove home in silence, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind replaying the moment over and over. "The light is better for you there. Your face is ruining it. Just step aside, Dad." Each word landed fresh. Each laugh echoed louder. But somewhere between their house and mine, something shifted inside me. Not breaking. I had done enough breaking over the past 2 years. This was different. This was waking up. As I pulled into my empty driveway, I realized what had actually happened in that living room. That moment was not an accident. It was not a joke gone wrong. It was permission. Permission to finally see them clearly without the fog of hope or the blindness of love. They had shown me exactly who they were, and for the first time in years, I was ready to believe them. The house was dark when I walked through the front door. I didn't bother turning on the lights. After 2 years of living alone, I had memorized every corner, every step, every shadow. Margaret used to tease me about my night vision, calling me her owl, her quiet guardian, who could navigate any darkness. Tonight, the darkness felt appropriate. It matched something inside me that I was only beginning to understand. I sat in my armchair by the window, the one Margaret had picked out 30 years ago, because she said it caught the morning light perfectly. Outside, the street was quiet. A few houses still glowed with the warmth of families gathered together, silhouettes moving behind curtains, laughter. I could imagine, even if I could not hear it. I wondered if any of those families had a father sitting alone in the dark, replaying the moment his own son told him to step aside. The memories came without invitation, the way they always do when you sit still long enough. I thought about Daniel's first day of college, how proud I had been writing that tuition check, how Margaret and I had driven him to campus and helped him unpack his tiny dorm room. He had hugged me at the end of that day, really hugged me, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." I believed him then. I believed every word. I thought about the down payment for his first house, the one he and Lauren bought 3 years into their marriage, $40,000 transferred without hesitation, because that is what fathers do. Lauren had sent a thank you card, a generic one with flowers on the front, signed only with her name. Daniel never mentioned it at all. I told myself he was busy, overwhelmed with the move, adjusting to married life. I made excuses for him the way I had been making excuses for years. I thought about Margaret's funeral, the worst day of my life. The church had been full standing room only because Margaret touched so many lives with her kindness. I stood at the front, accepting condolences, shaking hands, trying to hold myself together for just a few more hours. And then Lauren appeared beside me, not to offer comfort, but to complain. "The catering is costing more than we budgeted," she whispered, while mourners filed past my wife's casket. "We should have gone with the cheaper option." I stared at her, unable to form words, and she simply shrugged and walked away to greet someone more important. Daniel said nothing. He heard her, I know he did, but he said nothing. The birthdays blurred together in my memory, each one more forgettable than the last. A text message instead of a call instead of a visit cut short because Lauren had somewhere else to be. Last year they forgot entirely. I waited by the phone until midnight, then poured myself a drink and went to bed. Daniel called 2 days later, apologetic but not quite sorry, blaming work, blaming schedules, blaming everything except himself. I forgave him because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. But tonight, sitting in the darkness, I could not find forgiveness anywhere inside me. The laughter in that living room had stripped something away, some protective layer I had built around my heart, and what remained underneath was a truth I had been refusing to see. Daniel did not laugh because he was nervous. He did not make that joke because Lauren pressured him. He made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice to align himself with the woman who had just humiliated his father in front of everyone. He chose her comfort over my dignity. He chose belonging over loyalty. And the worst part, the part that cut deepest, was that this was not a new choice. He had been making it for years, one small betrayal at a time, until the man I raised had vanished entirely. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle in the backyard, running alongside him with my hand on the seat, promising I would not let go until he was ready. I remembered building model airplanes at the kitchen table, our heads bent together over tiny pieces, Margaret bringing us lemonade and calling us her two engineers. I remembered teaching him to drive, my foot hovering over an imaginary brake pedal, my heart pounding every time he changed lanes. That boy had looked at me like I hung the moon. That boy would never have laughed while I stood alone in a corner, rejected from my own family portrait. That boy was gone, and the man who remained was a stranger wearing my son's face. I do not know how long I sat there before Margaret's voice came back to me. Not a ghost, not a vision, just a memory so vivid it felt like she was sitting beside me in the darkness. It was something she had said a few weeks before she died, during one of her lucid afternoons when the medication allowed her to be fully herself. I had asked about her day, and she mentioned that Lauren had come by for tea. Just the two of us, Margaret had said, her eyes holding something I could not quite read. We talked for hours. I understand her now. Completely. At the time, I thought she meant it as a kindness. Margaret always looked for the good in people, even when it required imagination. I assumed she had found some common ground with Lauren, some shared interest or mutual understanding. I smiled and squeezed her hand and did not ask any questions. But now, in the silence of our empty house, those words felt different. I understand her now, completely. Margaret never said she liked Lauren. She never said she trusted her. She said she understood her. And Margaret, my brilliant, perceptive Margaret, never used words carelessly. I stood from the chair and walked to the window, watching the moon cast silver light across the lawn. She used to tend with such care. Margaret had seen something. Something about Lauren, about Daniel, about the future that was coming. She had tried to tell me in her own way, and I had been too blind, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in family to hear it. That night, something in me stopped breaking and started waking up. Margaret had seen something I had missed for years. I just had to figure out what. The morning after the photograph incident, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years. The grief fog that had surrounded me since Margaret's death seemed thinner somehow, as if the humiliation had burned away some of the haze. I made coffee the way I always did, measured and precise, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook I had not opened in months. It was time to stop making excuses. It was time to remember everything I had chosen to forget. The memories came easily once I stopped resisting them. Small moments individually forgettable, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner 4 years ago when I started telling a story about my early days in consulting. I was barely 2 sentences in when Lauren rolled her eyes so dramatically that Melissa laughed out loud. Daniel changed the subject without acknowledging I had been speaking at all. I finished my meal in silence and left early, telling myself they were just tired from hosting. I remembered birthday dinners where I was seated at the far end of the table, separated from conversation by distance and noise. I remembered offering advice about investments, about career decisions, about life, only to be dismissed with that patronizing phrase Lauren had perfected. Times have changed, Dad. You would not understand. As if experience had an expiration date. As if wisdom became worthless the moment it came from someone over 60. I remembered the Christmas when I suggested we continue Margaret's tradition of volunteering at the shelter on Christmas morning. Lauren had looked at me as if I had proposed something obscene. "That is really not our thing," she said, and Daniel nodded along like he had never spent a single holiday serving meals beside his mother. The tradition died that day, buried without ceremony, and no one mentioned Margaret's name for the rest of the visit. But the memory that surfaced most vividly, the one I had tried hardest to bury, came from a summer evening 2 years ago. I had arrived early at Daniel's house, earlier than expected, and let myself in with the key they had reluctantly given me. The kitchen window was open, and I heard voices drifting from the backyard. Lauren and Daniel speaking in tones they never used when they knew I was listening. "Your father is a financial asset," Lauren said, her voice carrying that cold practicality she usually disguised with smiles. "Not a family member. Treat him accordingly, keep him comfortable, keep him happy, and keep him writing checks. That is his purpose now." I waited for Daniel to defend me. I waited for him to say something, anything, to push back against reducing his father to a bank account with a heartbeat. But all I heard was silence, followed by the clink of glasses and the change of subject. I left before they knew I had arrived, drove around the block 3 times, and returned at the expected hour with a smile I didn't feel. I never mentioned what I heard. I told myself I must have misunderstood, that context was missing, that my son could not possibly see me that way. Now I understood that I had heard exactly what I was meant to understand. I had simply refused to believe it. The Lawsons had never bothered to hide their perspective. Richard and Melissa viewed family gatherings as inventory assessments, opportunities to evaluate assets and plan acquisitions. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same territory. "That is a beautiful house you have, Arthur. Must be worth quite a bit now with the market the way it is. Have you thought about your estate planning?" It is never too early to get things in order, for the family's sake. Melissa was the more direct of the two. At a dinner last spring, after her 3rd glass of wine, she had leaned across the table and said something I would never forget. "It is not greed, Arthur. It is practicality. Old people do not need all that money. They are not going to spend it. Better to pass it along while you can still see it put to good use." She laughed as if she had said something charming, and I watched Lauren smile at her mother with what looked like admiration, pride even, a student recognizing the master's technique. But even as I cataloged these offenses, 2 observations nagged at me, details that did not fit the pattern I was constructing. The first involved Richard. For all Melissa's boldness, her husband seemed diminished somehow. Whenever she spoke, especially when she made her cutting remarks about money and age and usefulness, Richard looked down at his hands. He did not laugh along. He did not contribute. He sat in silence with an expression I could only describe as defeated, the look of a man who had surrendered something essential long ago. They had been married for 35 years, yet he behaved less like a partner and more like a prisoner. It struck me as strange, but I filed it away without understanding why it mattered. The second observation was closer to home and more painful to examine. Daniel had been different for the past 5 years, not just distant, but anxious, avoiding direct conversation, deflecting every attempt I made to address problems between us. Whenever I tried to discuss Lauren's behavior or the growing coldness in our relationship or anything of substance at all, he would cut me off with the same phrase. "Let it go, Dad? Just let it go." His eyes would dart away, his shoulders would tense, and he would change the subject with almost desperate urgency. Something had changed 5 years ago. Some invisible line had been crossed, but I could not identify what it was. The son I knew would have talked to me. The son I knew would have explained. This version of Daniel seemed afraid of something I couldn't see. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the garden Margaret had loved. The roses needed pruning. The hedges had grown wild. I had let so many things go untended, so many warning signs go unexamined, because tending to them would have meant admitting that something was deeply wrong. They thought kindness meant weakness. They thought patience meant surrender. They were about to learn the difference. The decision to fight back came quietly, without fanfare or declaration. It simply arrived, settling into my bones like something that had always belonged there. But fighting required information, and information required access to things I had nearly forgotten I possessed. 3 years ago, after a string of break-ins in Daniel's neighborhood, I had offered to install a comprehensive home security system as a gift. I hired the best company in Denver, paid for the premium package, and set everything up myself over a long weekend. Daniel had been grateful at the time, or at least he pretended to be. Lauren barely acknowledged the gesture, though she seemed pleased enough when I explained that the cameras covered every entrance and most of the common areas. What neither of them seemed to remember, or perhaps never fully understood, was that I had configured the system myself. The cameras fed to a cloud server. The login credentials were in my name. I had remote access to everything, a feature I had never used because I trusted my son and respected his privacy. Privacy, I was beginning to understand, had been a courtesy, extended to people who deserved none in return. I sat at my computer that evening with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. My hands hesitated over the keyboard. Part of me still wanted to believe that what happened at the dinner party was a momentary lapse, a joke gone wrong, something that could be explained away with enough goodwill. But the notebook full of memories sat open beside me, pages covered with evidence I could no longer ignore. I typed in the credentials and waited for the footage to load. The living room camera had captured everything. I scrubbed backward through the timeline until I found the beginning of the dinner party, then watched with the clinical detachment I had developed over decades of crisis management. The early footage showed nothing unusual. Guests arriving, coats being taken, drinks being poured. I saw myself enter the frame carrying the expensive wine I had brought as a peace offering. Lauren greeted me with her practiced smile. From this angle, I could see what I had missed in person. The smile dropped the moment I turned away, replaced by something colder, something calculating. I continued watching, speeding through the dinner itself, slowing down when the photo session began. This is where everything changed. This is where I saw the truth. Lauren did not spontaneously decide to take a family photo. She had been preparing for it all evening. I watched her check the camera placement twice during dinner, glancing up at the security camera in the corner, adjusting her position slightly each time. She knew exactly where the lens was pointed. She knew exactly what it would capture. At the time, I assumed she was simply being vain, checking her appearance in some imagined reflection. Now I understood she was staging a scene. When she gathered everyone for the photo, her movements were precise and deliberate. She positioned Richard and Melissa first, guiding them to their marks like actors on a set. She placed Daniel beside them, adjusting his shoulders, tilting his chin. Then she turned toward where I stood and gestured for me to come closer. "Stand over here, Dad. The light is better for you there." I watched myself move to the corner. She indicated, grateful and oblivious, stepping directly into the trap she had prepared. But it was the next moment that made my blood run cold. Before calling me over, before I had even moved from my spot near the bookshelf, Lauren made a small gesture toward her mother. A hand signal, quick and subtle, easily missed if you were not looking for it. Melissa nodded almost imperceptibly. A few seconds later, Lauren made the same gesture toward Daniel. He glanced at his wife, then looked away, his jaw tightening in what I now recognized as resignation rather than surprise. They knew. They all knew what was about to happen because Lauren had told them. She had coordinated the humiliation in advance, assigned roles, planned the timing. The laughter that erupted after her cutting remark was not spontaneous. It was rehearsed. I paused the footage and stared at the frozen image of my family, their faces captured mid-laugh, their cruelty preserved in digital clarity. My son stood among them, his mouth open in that laugh I would never forget, his eyes holding something I had refused to see until now. Not weakness, not confusion, complicity. I resumed the footage and watched myself leave my quiet exit, barely noticed by the celebrating group. Lauren checked her phone seconds after I closed the front door. She was smiling, not the practice smile she wore for me, but a genuine expression of triumph. She had accomplished exactly what she set out to do, but I was not finished. I had years of footage stored on that server, years of gatherings and holidays and visits I'd thought were simply awkward but normal family events. I began reviewing them systematically, starting with the most recent and working backward. What I found turned awkwardness into something far more sinister. The pattern was unmistakable once I knew what to look for. Lauren had been testing boundaries for years, each gathering pushing slightly further than the last. A dismissive comment here, an exclusionary seating arrangement there, jokes at my expense that grew sharper and more personal over time. She was conditioning the family to see me as a target, normalizing the disrespect so gradually that no single incident seemed worth confronting. And through it all, Daniel watched. He saw what was happening. He never warned me, never defended me, never pulled me aside to explain what his wife was doing. He simply let it happen, gathering after gathering, year after year, until public humiliation felt like the natural next step. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long time. The man I had been yesterday would have made excuses. He would have found some way to rationalize what he had seen, some explanation that preserved the illusion of family love. But that man had died in the corner of his son's living room, stepped out of the frame and never stepped back in. She did not just humiliate me, she choreographed it. Every angle, every laugh, every wound directed like a scene in a play. But she forgot one thing: the camera was still rolling. The footage had given me what I needed most: confirmation that my instincts were not failing me. But confirmation alone would not be enough. I had spent too many years solving problems for powerful organizations to believe that emotion could substitute for strategy. If I was going to respond to what Lauren had done, I would need to respond correctly. I would need to become the man I had been before retirement, before grief, before I chose gentleness over capability. People who met me in my later years saw only the quiet widower, the soft-spoken grandfather figure who brought expensive wine to family dinners and accepted dismissal with a patient smile. They didn't know about the 35 years that came before. They didn't know that I had built a career advising Fortune 500 companies through their darkest moments. Hostile takeovers, fraud investigations, complex negotiations with adversaries who had every advantage. I had navigated them all. My specialty was crisis management, which really meant understanding how systems failed and how people behaved when they believed they were winning. I had sat across the table from corporate raiders and union leaders and government regulators, and I had learned that the person who controlled information controlled the outcome. I had learned that patience was not passive, patience was tactical. When Margaret became ill, I stepped away from that world without hesitation. She needed me more than any client ever could, and I discovered that caring for her brought a different kind of purpose. After she died, I simply never went back. The skills remained dormant, but intact, waiting for a reason to resurface. Lauren had given me that reason. She just did not know it yet. The first call I made was to Evelyn Brooks. She had been Margaret's closest friend since their college days at Boulder, a bond that survived distance and decades, and the different directions their lives had taken. Evelyn became a lawyer specializing in estate planning and elder law. Margaret became a teacher, then a mother, then the center of my entire world. They spoke on the phone every Sunday for 40 years, sharing confidences I was never privy to and never asked about. At Margaret's funeral, Evelyn had held my hand and whispered that I should call her if I ever needed anything. I had not called until now. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the same warm authority I remembered from the memorial service. "Arthur," she said, and I could hear the surprise beneath the welcome. "I have been wondering when I would hear from you." We met at her office downtown, a modest suite in a building that spoke of competence rather than flash. Evelyn looked much as she had 2 years ago. Silver hair pulled back in a practical style, reading glasses perched on her nose, eyes sharp enough to catch lies before they finished forming. She gestured for me to sit and studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. I told her everything. The dinner party, the photograph, the laughter, the footage that revealed the orchestration behind it all. I told her about the patterns I had observed, the years of accumulated disrespect, the growing certainty that my son's wife had been systematically conditioning everyone to see me as a target. Evelyn listened without interrupting her expression, shifting from concern to recognition to something I could only describe as grim validation. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and released a long breath. "Margaret knew," she said quietly. "She never told me the details, but she knew something was wrong with that woman. She saw through Lauren long before anyone else did." The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had tried to warn me with her cryptic comment about understanding Lauren completely, and I had been too blind to hear it. How much had she seen that I had missed? How much had she carried alone because she knew I would not believe her? Evelyn seemed to read my thoughts. She stood and walked to a small safe in the corner of her office, entering a combination with practiced ease. When she returned, she was holding an envelope cream-colored and sealed with my name written across the front in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. "She gave this to me 6 months before she passed," Evelyn explained, placing the envelope on the desk between us. "The instructions were very specific. I was only supposed to give it to you when you were ready to fight." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "Are you ready, Arthur?" I stared at the envelope, at the familiar curves of Margaret's script, at this tangible piece of her that had been waiting for me all along. Every instinct told me to tear it open immediately to discover whatever truth she had preserved for this moment. But I forced myself to stop. I had learned long ago that information was only useful when you knew how to apply it. I did not yet understand the full scope of what I was facing. "Not yet," I said, and the words cost me more than I expected. "I need to understand the landscape first. I need to know what is legally possible before I know what she left for me." Evelyn nodded slowly, and I saw approval in her expression. "Then, let me educate you," she said. She began explaining the legal framework that would govern whatever battle lay ahead. Colorado was a one-party consent state, which meant that any recording made by a participant in a conversation was fully admissible. Trust funds could include protective provisions that activated under specific conditions, and elder financial exploitation, the deliberate manipulation or theft of an elderly person's assets, was a felony under state law, carrying serious consequences for anyone convicted. She also told me about the document known as a family financial agreement, a tool she had used many times to clarify inheritance expectations and prevent exactly the kind of pressure I had been experiencing. Properly drafted, such a document could either grant access or permanently remove it depending on how it was structured. The battlefield was becoming clearer. Lauren wanted my assets. The Lawsons saw me as a resource to be harvested, and Daniel, whatever his reasons, had chosen to facilitate their plans rather than protect his father. But they were operating on assumptions that no longer applied. They assumed I was passive. They assumed I was ignorant. They assumed I would never fight back. Evelyn looked at me with something like admiration as I processed everything she had shared. Margaret always said you were the most patient man she knew. She just wanted to make sure that patience was not wasted. She glanced at the envelope still sitting between us. When you are ready, this will be here. I was not ready to open the envelope yet, but I was ready to understand what I was fighting. The call came 3 days after my meeting with Evelyn, though it felt inevitable from the moment I left her office. Daniel's voice on the phone was strained, the words clearly rehearsed. Dad, we need to have a family meeting. Lauren's parents will be there. It is about the future, about making sure everyone is on the same page. I agreed without argument, suggested they come to my house, and heard the surprise in his pause before he accepted. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for resistance. My cooperation threw them off balance, which was exactly what I intended. They arrived together on Saturday afternoon, a unified front pulling into my driveway in 2 cars that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. I watched from the window as they assembled on my porch, Lauren leading the way with Richard and Melissa flanking her like generals accompanying a conquering army. Daniel trailed behind his shoulders, hunched in that anxious posture I had noticed so often in recent years. He looked like a man being marched to something he dreaded but could not escape. I opened the door before they could ring the bell and welcomed them with the warmest smile I could manufacture. The living room had been prepared carefully, chairs arranged in a configuration that put me at a slight disadvantage facing all 4 of them at once. I had done this deliberately. Let them feel powerful. Let them feel confident. Confident people made mistakes. Richard cleared his throat and began what was clearly a prepared speech. Arthur, we have been talking as a family, and we believe it is time to formalize some arrangements. For everyone's benefit. For harmony. He produced a folder from his briefcase, crisp and professional, filled with documents I had no intention of signing. We have put together a proposal that we think makes sense for everyone involved. Melissa leaned forward with that expression of concerned practicality she had perfected over decades. You are getting older, Arthur. We all want to make sure your assets are protected, that they go where they should go when the time comes. Adding Lauren to your trust as co-beneficiary just makes sense. She is family now. She should be treated like family. Lauren nodded earnestly, playing her part with conviction. This is what Margaret would have wanted, she said, and I felt something cold move through my chest at the sound of my wife's name in her calculating mouth. She always talked about family unity, about making sure everyone was taken care of. We are just trying to honor her wishes. The performance was impressive in its coordination. They had clearly rehearsed each person delivering their lines at the appropriate moment, building pressure layer by layer. Richard handled the logical arguments, Melissa provided the emotional manipulation, and Lauren invoked Margaret's memory like a weapon designed specifically to wound me. Daniel said nothing. He sat in the corner staring at his hands, radiating the misery of a man trapped between forces he could not control. I listened patiently, asking occasional questions, letting them believe their arguments were landing. When they finished, I asked for a few minutes to think and excused myself to the kitchen. Richard followed me under the pretense of getting water, but I knew he had something else on his mind. We stood at the counter in silence for a moment before he spoke. Sometimes people do things they regret for the rest of their lives, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. Don't let that happen to you, Arthur. The words sounded like a threat, a warning that resistance would bring consequences. But something in his delivery did not match the message. His voice carried fatigue rather than menace. His shoulders were slumped, and when he finally looked at me, I saw something unexpected in his eyes. It looked almost like shame, like a man delivering lines he had been ordered to speak, hating every syllable. I filed the observation away without understanding it. There would be time to analyze Richard later. We returned to the living room and I took my seat facing the assembled family. They watched me with barely concealed anticipation, predators waiting for their prey to stop struggling. I let the silence stretch for a long moment before I spoke. "You are right," I said simply. "It is time to formalize things." The reaction was everything I had expected. Lauren's eyes widened. Melissa clasped her hands together in triumph. Richard exhaled slowly, though whether from relief or something else I could not tell. Even Daniel looked up from his hands, surprise breaking through his anxious fog. I continued before they could respond. "I have been thinking about this for a while, and I agree that we need clarity. I will have my lawyer draft a family financial agreement that makes everyone's position clear. Lauren can sign it, and we will all know exactly where we stand." Lauren was already nodding eagerly. "Of course, Dad. Whatever you think is best. We just want everything to be transparent." I smiled at her use of that word. Transparent. She had no idea how transparent things were about to become. The meeting ended with an atmosphere of celebration that made my stomach turn. Melissa insisted on opening a bottle of champagne she had apparently brought in anticipation of victory. Glasses were raised, toasts were made. Lauren hugged me for the first time in years, her arms wrapping around me in an embrace that felt like a snake coiling around its prey. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." I hugged her back, keeping my expression soft and grateful, while my mind cataloged every detail of her performance. She was already spending money she would never receive, already planning how to leverage access she would never have. The document Evelyn was preparing would do exactly what I promised. It would make everyone's position crystal clear. But the clarity would not favor Lauren. The agreement she would sign, too arrogant to read carefully, too confident to question the terms, would legally confirm that she had no claim whatsoever to the Whitman Trust. Not now. Not ever. When they finally left, still glowing with premature victory, I stood at the window and watched their cars disappear down the street. Daniel had not spoken a single word during the entire meeting. He had simply sat there complicit in silence while his wife and in-laws tried to strip his father of everything. When I said yes, they celebrated. Champagne was poured. Lauren hugged me for the first time in years. They thought they had finally broken me, but I was just handing them the shovel to dig their own grave. The week following the family meeting was consumed by preparation. Every morning I drove to Evelyn's office where we worked through the legal architecture that would protect everything Margaret and I had built together. Every afternoon I returned home to review documents, organize records, and strengthen the foundation of what was coming. I had spent decades helping corporations defend themselves against hostile forces. Now I was applying those same principles to my own life. The trust Margaret and I had created years ago contained provisions I had nearly forgotten. She had insisted on including them over my mild objections, arguing that we could never be too careful, that family dynamics could change in ways we could not predict. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now I understood she had been preparing for exactly this scenario. The protective clauses she had demanded were still there, dormant, but legally binding, waiting to be activated. Evelyn and I worked through each provision methodically. The trust now required explicit trustee approval for any distribution of assets, and I was the sole trustee. No one could access funds without my written consent. More importantly, any attempt to obtain access through coercion, manipulation, or undue influence would trigger an automatic freeze and mandatory investigation. The language was precise and comprehensive, crafted by lawyers who understood how families could turn predatory. Lauren could pressure me all she wanted. The moment she crossed certain lines, everything would lock down and legal scrutiny would follow. The family financial agreement was the centerpiece of our strategy. Evelyn had drafted it with exquisite care, using language that sounded generous while delivering the opposite. By signing the document, Lauren would formally acknowledge that she had no legal claim to any Whitman family assets, that any gifts received were complete and final, and that she waived all rights to contest or challenge the trust's distribution. The agreement also included a clause stating that she had read and understood every provision, eliminating any future defense of ignorance. It was a legal trap disguised as a family gesture, and Lauren had walked directly into it. While organizing the paperwork for these changes, I began reviewing financial records I had not examined in years. Margaret had always handled our household accounts with meticulous precision, but there were certain funds I managed separately, emergency reserves set aside for true catastrophes. I rarely checked these accounts because their purpose was to exist untouched, a safety net that would only be needed in the worst circumstances. When I finally opened the statements, what I found made me stop breathing. 5 years ago, $50,000 had been withdrawn from my emergency fund. The transaction was dated, documented, and completely unauthorized. I stared at the numbers, my mind racing through possibilities. I had not made this withdrawal. Margaret had not made it either, as her health had already begun declining by that point, and she had no access to this particular account. There was only one other person who knew the account existed. Only one person I had trusted enough to share the information in case something happened to me. Daniel. The timing struck me like a physical blow. 5 years ago was exactly when my son's behavior had changed. 5 years ago was when he became distant, anxious, unable to meet my eyes. 5 years ago was when he started saying, "Let it go, Dad," whenever I tried to have a real conversation. I had attributed the change to marriage, to stress, to the natural drifting apart that sometimes happened between fathers and sons. But now a different explanation presented itself, one that made terrible sense. Daniel had taken the money, and something had happened afterward, something that explained his transformation from my confident, capable son into the nervous, compliant man who sat silent while his wife humiliated his father. The $50,000 was connected to his change, connected to his fear, connected to whatever hold Lauren seemed to have over him. I did not yet understand the full picture, but I understood enough to know that this discovery changed everything. I set the bank statements aside and continued my preparations, adding this new piece to the puzzle I was assembling. When the time came to confront Daniel, I would have evidence. When the time came for answers, I would not be asking blindly. 2 weeks after our family meeting, Lauren requested a brief visit. "Just checking in," she said on the phone, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. I welcomed her into my home with the same warm smile I had perfected, offering coffee and small talk, while she settled into Margaret's favorite chair as if it already belonged to her. She wasted no time revealing her state of mind. "I have been thinking about our new financial arrangement," she announced, crossing her legs and leaning forward with barely contained excitement. "There are so many opportunities we should discuss, vacation properties that could be wonderful investments, some legacy planning strategies that would benefit everyone. We should really sit down with a financial advisor and map out the next few years." I listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions that encouraged her to reveal more. She spoke about my assets as if they were already hers, describing renovations. She envisioned for my house investments, she wanted to redirect charitable foundations she thought would enhance the family's reputation. Her plans were elaborate and detailed, the product of hours of scheming, all built on the assumption that the document she had signed granted her everything she desired. She had not read it. I knew this with absolute certainty, because if she had, she would not be sitting in my living room discussing legacy planning. She would be consulting lawyers and demanding explanations. Instead, she was dreaming aloud about money she would never touch, property she would never own, a future that existed only in her imagination. When she finally left, kissing my cheek with theatrical affection, I watched her car disappear down the street and allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. Not at her impending downfall, but at the confirmation of everything I had suspected. She was careless because she was arrogant. She had signed without reading because she believed she had already conquered. She saw my compliance as surrender, my patience as weakness, my silence as defeat. She mistook my silence for surrender. She mistook my patience for weakness. But I have spent 35 years reading adversaries. Lauren thought she was the only one playing chess. She did not realize I had already seen the endgame. I called Daniel the next morning and asked him to come alone. No Lauren, no excuses, no delays. Just father and son the way it used to be before everything changed. He hesitated on the phone, his breath catching in a way that told me he sensed something was different. But he agreed, perhaps because refusing would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. He arrived at my house looking like a man walking toward his own execution. His face was pale, his movements careful, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for hidden dangers. I had set 2 chairs facing each other in the living room, close enough for conversation but far enough to give us both space. The bank statements sat in a folder on the table beside me, waiting. I didn't offer coffee. I did not make small talk. I simply gestured for him to sit, and when he did, I opened the folder and placed the documents in front of him. His eyes dropped to the page, and I watched the color drain from his face as he recognized what he was seeing. 5 years ago, I said calmly, $50,000 was withdrawn from my emergency fund. I did not authorize it. Your mother did not authorize it. You are the only other person who knew that account existed. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the bank statement, then at me, then back at the paper, as if hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less damning. His hands trembled slightly as he set the document down. Dad, he started, his voice cracking. I can explain. It is not what you think. I waited. I had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than accusation. People filled silence with truth when they could no longer bear the weight of it. So I sat quietly, my expression neutral, giving him nothing to push against, nothing to deflect. He tried several approaches. He mentioned market conditions and business challenges. He referenced unexpected expenses and temporary cash flow problems. He spoke in circles, never quite arriving at the point, each excuse more hollow than the last. But I did not interrupt. I did not help him. I simply waited. And finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Daniel broke. His shoulders collapsed inward, his head dropped, and the words came spilling out in a rush of confession that had been building for 5 years. My business was failing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything was falling apart. I had investors threatening to sue employees. I could not pay loans coming due that I could not cover. I was going to lose everything, Dad. Everything I had worked for. I panicked. He looked up at me, tears forming in his eyes. I took the money thinking I could pay it back before you noticed. It was just supposed to be a bridge, a temporary solution until I could stabilize things. I never meant to steal from you. I swear I was going to return every penny. I absorbed his words without reaction, though inside I felt something shifting. Pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. This explained the withdrawal, but it did not explain everything else. It did not explain 5 years of distance, of anxiety, of watching his wife humiliate me without ever speaking up. What happened next, I asked quietly. Daniel's face contorted with a pain I had never seen before. Lauren found out, he said. She was going through our finances looking for something else entirely, and she found the transfer. She knew exactly what it meant. He paused, struggling to continue, but I needed to hear it. I needed him to say the words. She told me that if I ever confessed to you, she would make sure you knew everything. She said she would tell you I was a thief, that I had been stealing from you for years, that I could not be trusted. She said you would never look at me the same way again, that I would lose your respect, the inheritance, everything, including her. The room felt colder. I understood now why my son had become a stranger, why he sat silent during Lauren's attacks, why he could never meet my eyes. He had not simply chosen his wife over his father. He had been trapped by her, controlled through fear and shame. His own mistake transformed into a chain she held around his neck, but understanding did not erase the wound. Sympathy did not dissolve the anger building in my chest. You let her treat me like a fool for 5 years. I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. You watched her humiliate me, exclude me, reduce me to nothing more than a source of money. You could have told me the truth at any point. You could have come to me and confessed. I would have been angry about the money, yes. But I would have forgiven you, Daniel. You are my son. I would have found a way to forgive you. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs he had apparently held inside for half a decade. I know, he choked out. I know I should have told you. But I was so afraid. She made me believe that telling you would destroy everything. The part of me that was still his father wanted to embrace him, to tell him everything would be all right, to fix this the way I had fixed so many of his problems when he was young. But another part, the part that had been awakened by Lauren's cruelty and sharpened by weeks of painful discovery, could not move past the central truth. Daniel had chosen. Every day, for 5 years, he had chosen silence. He had chosen to protect himself rather than warn me. He had chosen comfort over courage, fear over loyalty, his marriage over his father. I could forgive the theft. $50,000 was a wound, but it was a wound that would heal. What I could not easily forgive was watching him sit in that living room corner while his wife orchestrated my humiliation. What I could not easily forgive was every let it go. Dad, every deflected conversation, every moment he could have been honest and chose deception instead. I looked at my son. really looked at him for the first time in years. He was not the villain I had been constructing in my mind. He was something more complicated, a man who had made a terrible choice and then been trapped by the consequences, a victim who had also become an accomplice. I didn't know yet what to do with that complexity. You could have told me the truth 5 years ago, I said quietly. I would have forgiven you then. The money never mattered, but you chose silence, Daniel, and silence has a price. Daniel left my house that evening without resolution. I had not offered forgiveness, and he had not asked for it directly. We simply sat in the weight of everything that had been revealed until the silence became unbearable and he mumbled something about needing to go. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the dusk, and I wondered if I would ever look at my son without seeing the 5 years of chosen silence standing between us. But I could not dwell on Daniel. His confession had unlocked something else, something I had been postponing since my first meeting with Evelyn. I walked back inside, retrieved my phone, and dialed her number before I could change my mind. I am ready, I said when she answered. She did not ask what I meant. She simply said she would meet me at her office in 1 hour. The drive downtown felt longer than usual, each traffic light stretching the anticipation until my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. Evelyn was waiting when I arrived, the sealed envelope already on her desk positioned exactly where I had left it weeks ago. She gestured for me to sit, then slid the envelope across to me without ceremony. Whatever is inside, she said quietly. Margaret wanted you to have it at exactly this moment, when you were ready to fight and understood what you were fighting against. I picked up the envelope and studied Margaret's handwriting one final time. My name curved across the front in her elegant script, each letter a connection to the woman I had loved for over 40 years. I slid my finger under the seal and opened it carefully as if the paper itself was precious. Inside were 2 items. The first was a USB drive, small and black, unmarked except for a strip of tape with a date written in Margaret's hand. The date was from 2.5 years ago, 6 months before she died. The second item was a folded piece of stationery, cream-colored and familiar, the same paper she had used for important letters throughout our marriage. I unfolded the note and read the words she had left for me. My dearest Arthur, I always knew you would fight when the time was right. You are the most patient man I have ever known, but patience has limits, and some battles cannot be avoided. This is your shield and your sword. Use it wisely. I love you forever in this life and whatever comes next. Margaret. My vision blurred. I blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall, needing to stay clear for whatever came next. Evelyn watched me in respectful silence, understanding that this moment belonged to Margaret and me alone. I handed her the USB drive. She inserted it into her laptop and we waited as the file loaded. There was only one audio file labeled simply with a date and time. Evelyn clicked play, and suddenly the room filled with voices I had not heard together in over 2 years. Margaret's voice came first, warm and welcoming, offering tea and complimenting something Lauren was wearing. Then Lauren responded, her tone bright and charming, the performance she used when she believed she was winning someone over. They exchanged pleasantries for several minutes, discussing trivial things, building the kind of rapport that Lauren probably thought was genuine. Then the conversation shifted. I have been thinking about the future, Lauren said on the recording, her voice taking on a confidential quality. About what happens as Arthur gets older. He is not going to live forever, and we need to be practical about what comes next. Margaret's response was neutral, encouraging. Go on. Lauren continued, apparently believing she had found an ally. Once Arthur is gone, everything will be ours. The house, the investments, the trust fund, all of it. Daniel will not resist. He is too weak to stand up to me, and honestly, he does not have the spine to manage money anyway. And his father is so desperate for family harmony, so afraid of conflict, that he will give us anything we ask for. We just have to be patient and keep him comfortable until nature takes its course. I listened to my wife's silence on the recording, imagining her face, the careful neutrality she must have maintained while hearing her daughter-in-law casually discuss waiting for her husband to die. Thank you for being so honest with me, Lauren. Margaret finally said, her voice carrying a calm that I now recognized as steel wrapped in silk. I understand you completely now. The recording ended. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of Evelyn's laptop. I sat motionless, the weight of what I had just heard pressing down on my chest like a physical force. Evelyn spoke first. Colorado is a one-party consent state, she said, her lawyer's voice cutting through the emotional fog. Margaret was a participant in that conversation. She had had every legal right to record it. This is admissible evidence, Arthur, fully admissible. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Combined with the document Lauren signed, waiving her claims to your trust, the security footage showing the orchestrated humiliation, the pattern of financial pressure from the Lawson family, and now, this recording proving premeditation and intent, you have everything you need. Your wife did not just love you, Arthur. She built you a fortress. I could not respond. The implications were still sinking in, layer after layer of realization washing over me. Margaret had known. She had seen through Lauren years before anyone else recognized the predator hiding behind the charming smile, understood exactly what her son's wife was planning. And instead of simply warning me, which I might not have believed, she had done something far more powerful. She had collected evidence. She had prepared weapons. She had made sure that when the fight finally came, I would not be defenseless. I sat in silence as Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, hearing her speak for the first time in 2 years. The warmth of her greeting, the patience of her questions, the quiet steel of her final words. She had known. All along she had known, and she had spent her final months making sure I would never face this fight alone. My wife had not just loved me. She had defended me from beyond the grave. I spent 3 days preparing for the meeting that would change everything. Evelyn helped me structure the confrontation with the same precision we had applied to every other aspect of this battle. We discussed timing, sequencing, the psychological impact of each revelation. By the time I made the calls, I knew exactly how the afternoon would unfold. The only variable was how each person would react when their carefully constructed world collapsed around them. I summoned everyone to my house on a Saturday afternoon. The invitation was framed as a celebration, a family gathering to finalize the financial arrangements we had discussed. Lauren accepted immediately, her voice bright with anticipation. Melissa called back within minutes to confirm, already talking about the champagne she would bring. Richard said little, agreeing with a quiet yes that carried undertones I could not quite read. Daniel hesitated before accepting, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that remained unresolved between us. Evelyn arrived first, positioning herself in the corner of the living room with a briefcase containing documents and a laptop ready to play the recording. She was there as my legal witness, but also as Margaret's representative, the keeper of secrets that were finally ready to be revealed. The Lawsons arrived together, pulling into my driveway with the confidence of conquerors, returning to claim their prize. Lauren entered first, kissing my cheek with theatrical warmth, already complimenting the house as if mentally redecorating it. Melissa followed close behind, her eyes scanning the room with the appraising gaze of an auctioneer. Richard came last, nodding at me without speaking, settling into a chair near the window with an expression I could not decipher. Daniel arrived alone, his face pale and drawn. He had not told Lauren about our conversation. I could see the secret sitting between them, invisible but massive, shaping every interaction without her even knowing it existed. He took a seat apart from his wife, and I noticed she did not seem to register the distance. When everyone was settled, I remained standing. The room fell quiet, expectation hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. Lauren smiled at me, waiting for the moment when I would officially surrender everything she had been working toward for years. I did not offer pleasantries. I did not ease into the subject. I simply nodded to Evelyn, who pressed play on the laptop. Margaret's voice filled the room, first warm and familiar, offering tea. Then, Lauren's voice joined hers, bright and charming, completely unaware of what was coming. The assembled family listened in confusion as the conversation unfolded, not yet understanding what they were hearing. Then, Lauren's words from 2.5 years ago cut through the silence. Once Arthur is gone, everything will be ours. Daniel will not resist. He is too weak. And his father is so desperate for family harmony that he will give us anything we ask for. We just have to be patient and keep him comfortable until nature takes its course. Lauren's face went white. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by shock that aged her 10 years in an instant. She looked at me, then at Evelyn, then at the laptop, as if it had physically attacked her. "That is not me," she said, her voice high and trembling. "That is fake. Someone manipulated it. Arthur, you cannot seriously believe." The recording continued, playing her own voice, contradicting every denial. Margaret's calm response echoed through the room. "Thank you for being so honest with me, Lauren. I understand you completely now." Melissa leaped to her feet, her face flushed with fury. "This is outrageous," she shouted. "This is entrapment. You cannot ambush us like this with doctored recordings." We will sue you for defamation. We will. I raised my hand and something in my expression made her stop. This recording was made by my wife, I said calmly. Margaret was a participant in the conversation. Colorado law allows one party to record without the other's consent. Every word Lauren spoke is admissible evidence. Lauren was shaking now, her composure completely shattered. She looked at Daniel, desperate for support, but he would not meet her eyes. She looked at her mother, who was already calculating damage control strategies. She looked at her father. Richard Lawson had not moved since the recording began. He sat by the window with his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable, watching the destruction of his daughter's carefully constructed facade. When Lauren's eyes met his pleading for help, something shifted in his expression. He stood up. The room fell silent. Even Melissa stopped her sputtering protest, turning to look at her husband with an expression caught between confusion and warning. Richard walked slowly to the center of the room, positioning himself between his family and mine. "This stops here," he said quietly. Lauren's face twisted with disbelief. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Sit down. We need to fight this together. We need to." Richard shook his head, cutting her off. "I have watched this pattern for too long," he said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to stretch back decades. "I watched your mother do it to my family. I watched her teach you how to do it to others. I stayed silent because I was afraid, because fighting seemed impossible, because I convinced myself it was not my responsibility to stop it." He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never expected to find. Recognition. Understanding. Shame. "What I should have done 30 years ago," he said, "was stand up and tell the truth. I did not have the courage then. I have it now." The man I had written off as my enemy stood in the middle of his family's ruin and chose truth over blood. Lauren screamed at him to sit down. Melissa grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve, but Richard Lawson had already made his choice. "I have watched this pattern long enough," he said, gently removing his wife's hand. "It ends today." The room remained frozen in the aftermath of Richard's declaration. Melissa still gripped his arm, her knuckles white with desperation, but he stood immovable, a man who had finally found solid ground after decades of sinking. Lauren stared at her father as if he had transformed into a stranger before her eyes. Daniel watched from his corner, silent and pale, perhaps recognizing something familiar in the dynamic unfolding before him. Richard gently freed himself from Melissa's grasp and turned to face the room. His voice was steady when he spoke, carrying the weight of words that had been imprisoned for 30 years. "When I married Melissa," he began, "I believed I had found a partner. She was charming, attentive, everything a young man thinks he wants. My family had money, a successful business my father had built from nothing. Melissa saw opportunity. She saw resources. She saw a future she could shape to her specifications." Melissa's face contorted with fury. "Richard, stop this immediately. You are embarrassing yourself. You are embarrassing all of us." He continued as if she had not spoken. "Within 2 years of our marriage, she had isolated me from my parents, my siblings, my closest friends. She convinced me they were toxic, that they did not have my best interests at heart, that only she truly understood me. By the time I realized what was happening, I had no one left to turn to." I watched this confession unfold with a strange mixture of horror and recognition. The tactics Richard described were identical to what I had observed Lauren using on Daniel, the same systematic dismantling of support structures, the same weaponization of charm, followed by control. My inheritance disappeared into accounts I could not access. Richard continued. "My father's business was sold without my consent, the proceeds redirected into investments that somehow never included my name. When I questioned anything, she had responses prepared. Tears when manipulation failed, rage when tears stopped working, and always, always the threat that leaving would destroy me completely." Melissa stood rigid, her face cycling through expressions like a malfunctioning mask. First came denial, a sharp laugh and a dismissive wave. "This is fantasy. He has always been prone to exaggeration." Then came tears, her voice cracking as she appealed to Lauren. "You know your father. You know he makes things up when he is upset. Tell them, Lauren, tell them this is not true." But Lauren could not speak. She was watching her mother with an expression I recognized from my own mirror in recent weeks. The dawning realization that someone you thought you knew was revealing depths you had never suspected. Richard turned to his daughter and his voice softened with something that might have been grief. "I watched your mother teach you everything she knew. The charm that disarms, the pressure that isolates, the humiliation that controls. I saw it happening, Lauren. I saw you learning her lessons, practicing her techniques, becoming exactly what she designed you to be. And I stayed silent because I was afraid. Because speaking up meant admitting what my marriage really was. Because telling the truth meant losing the only life I knew, even if that life was a prison. Melissa's tears evaporated, replaced by cold fury. You ungrateful man. Everything you have is because of me. Every opportunity, every connection, I gave you, everything, Richard interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. My family, my inheritance, my dignity, 30 years of silence while you taught our daughter to prey on decent people. He looked at me directly. Arthur lost his wife and nearly lost his son because of patterns that started in my home. I will not stay silent while it happens to another family. The room fell into heavy silence. Melissa had no more tactics left, no more masks to wear. She stood exposed in the ruins of an empire built on manipulation and maintained through fear. Lauren sat motionless, watching her mentor crumble, perhaps understanding for the first time that her own skills were not natural gifts, but inherited corruption. I reached into my pocket and withdrew Margaret's letter. There was one more piece I had not shared, words she had written that suddenly felt essential to this moment. My wife left me guidance, I said, unfolding the paper. She knew this day might come, and she wanted me to understand something important. I read aloud, my voice steady despite the emotion pressing against my chest. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Do not let guilt keep you from drawing lines. Protect what is yours not out of anger, but because you have earned peace. Some people will mistake your gentleness for weakness, your patience for permission. When that happens, remember that setting boundaries is not cruelty. It is self-respect. And self-respect is the foundation of every relationship worth having. The words settled over the room like a verdict. Margaret had understood something I was only now grasping. This confrontation was never about revenge. It was never about punishment or destruction or proving my strength. It was about protection, protecting what she and I had built together, protecting myself from people who saw my kindness as a resource to exploit, protecting whatever future remained for my relationship with my son. Richard nodded slowly, as if Margaret's words had reached across death to offer him absolution for 3 decades of silence. Melissa sat down heavily, her composure finally shattered beyond repair. Lauren remained frozen, unable to process the complete collapse of the world she had believed she controlled. Daniel spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "I'm so sorry." I looked at my son and saw the weight he had been carrying, the fear Lauren had cultivated, the silence that had cost us both so much. We would need to rebuild slowly and carefully without guarantees of success, but that rebuilding could only begin when the truth was fully spoken, when every shadow had been exposed to light. Melissa sat in ruins of her own creation, her husband's testimony still echoing in the silence. Lauren could not look at anyone, and I finally understood what Margaret had known all along. Some patterns do not stop until someone brave enough breaks them. Richard had carried that weight for 30 years. I could carry it from here. The silence that followed Richard's confession stretched until it became almost unbearable. Melissa had stopped trying to defend herself. Lauren sat motionless, her face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. Daniel remained in his corner, watching his wife with an expression caught somewhere between pity and relief. The family that had walked into my house expecting victory now sat in the wreckage of their own exposure. Evelyn stepped forward, her lawyer's instincts recognizing that the moment had come to clarify exactly what position everyone occupied. She addressed the room with professional calm, though I could see something like admiration flickering behind her careful demeanor. "Let me summarize the legal situation," she said, opening her briefcase and removing a folder of documents. "Arthur possesses an audio recording in which Lauren explicitly discusses her intention to exploit his assets and wait for his death. This recording was made legally under Colorado's one-party consent law. He possesses security footage showing coordinated psychological abuse and public humiliation. He possesses a signed document in which Lauren formally acknowledged she has no legal claim to any Whitman family assets, a document she signed without reading because she was too confident to imagine it could harm her. She paused, letting each point land before continuing. Additionally, Arthur has documentation of a pattern consistent with elder financial exploitation under Colorado law. This includes the pressure tactics, the isolation from support systems, the systematic degradation designed to weaken his resistance. These actions constitute a felony. Criminal charges could be filed, civil suits could be pursued, public exposure would be inevitable. Lauren's face had gone gray. Melissa looked like she might be physically ill. Even Richard, despite his courageous stand, seemed shaken by the comprehensive nature of the case against his wife and daughter. Evelyn closed her folder and looked at me. In summary, Arthur could pursue the complete financial and social destruction of everyone in this room who participated in or enabled this campaign against him. The evidence is overwhelming. The law is on his side. The outcome would not be in question. The room turned to me. I felt the weight of their attention, the fear emanating from Lauren and Melissa, the uncertain hope flickering in Daniel's eyes, the quiet solidarity from Richard. I held total power in this moment. Every person in this room understood that their future depended on what I chose to do next. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the woman who had loved me for over 40 years, who had seen this threat coming and prepared weapons she knew I might need. But I also thought about who she truly was, the teacher who believed in second chances, the volunteer who served meals to strangers, the wife who never let anger harden into cruelty. She had built me a fortress. She had not built me a war machine. I could take everything I said slowly. I could pursue criminal charges. I could ensure that Lauren and Melissa face prosecution, public humiliation, financial ruin. The evidence supports it. The law allows it. Part of me, the part that remembers every laugh at my expense, every dismissive comment, every moment of orchestrated degradation, wants to do exactly that. Lauren's breath caught. Melissa seemed to shrink into herself. But that is not who Margaret raised me to be. I continued. And it is not who I want to become. Destruction is easy. It requires nothing but the will to inflict pain. What takes strength is knowing when to stop, when enough is enough. When the boundary has been established and pushing further serves no purpose but cruelty. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Margaret had loved. The roses she planted still bloomed, still required tending, still connected me to her memory in ways that transcended words. I will not pursue criminal charges, I said. I will not seek public exposure or financial destruction. That is not the justice I need. Lauren made a small sound of relief, but I was not finished. What I will do is establish boundaries that will never be crossed again. Lauren and Melissa are permanently removed from my life, my finances, my legacy. The document Lauren signed ensures she has no legal claim to anything. The trust Margaret and I created will be distributed according to our original wishes, which did not include either of you. You will receive nothing from me, not because I hate you, but because you have demonstrated exactly what you would do with any access I might grant. I turned back to face them. Lauren's relief had curdled into something more complex. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to negotiate. Please, she said, her voice cracking. There must be something I can do, some way to make this right. I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves the opportunity to prove they have changed. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, trying to see past the manipulation and the schemes to whatever human core might still exist beneath. Perhaps it was there. Perhaps she was capable of genuine transformation. But that transformation, if it came, would not happen because I gave her access to what she had tried to steal. Forgiveness is not access, I said quietly. You can have one without the other. I choose to forgive you, Lauren, not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred would poison whatever years I have left. I forgive you for my own peace, not yours. But forgiveness does not mean trust. It does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean pretending that what you did was acceptable or that it can be erased by tears and promises. She stared at me, uncomprehending. What am I supposed to do? You will live with what you did, I said. You will wake up every morning knowing the kind of person you chose to become. You will watch your mother's marriage dissolve under the weight of 30 years of suppressed truth. You will see the damage you caused ripple through every relationship you have, and you will carry that knowledge forever. That is your consequence. Not prison, not poverty, just the truth about who you are reflected back at you every single day for the rest of your life. Lauren asked what she could do to make things right. I told her the truth. Living with what you did is the real punishment. I do not need to destroy you. You have already destroyed who you thought you were." She did not understand then, but she would. They always do eventually. The weeks following the confrontation unfolded with a quiet inevitability that required no action on my part. I had chosen not to pursue public exposure, but the truth has its own momentum. Word spreads in social circles, through channels that cannot be controlled, whispered conversations at charity events, careful questions over lunch, the sudden silence when certain names are mentioned. I did not need to destroy Lauren's reputation. She had provided all the necessary materials. I simply stepped back and let gravity do its work. The first signs appeared within days. Lauren was quietly removed from the board of a nonprofit she had championed for years. The explanation given was restructuring, but everyone understood the real reason. Invitations that had once filled her calendar stopped arriving. Friends who had crowded around her at parties began finding reasons to be elsewhere. The social media accounts she had cultivated so carefully grew silent, as former allies unfollowed and unfriended, distancing themselves from association with her name. For someone like Lauren, this was a devastation more complete than any legal consequence could have achieved. She had built her entire identity on social position, on being seen at the right events with the right people, on the careful curation of an image that projected success and sophistication. That image had shattered, and no amount of charm could reassemble the pieces. She still had her freedom, her home, her marriage to my son. But she had lost the currency that mattered most to her, and watching it slip away must have been its own particular torture. The Lawson family fractured along lines that had been invisible for 30 years. Richard filed for divorce 3 weeks after the confrontation, citing irreconcilable differences in language that barely hinted at the decades of suppressed truth behind his decision. Melissa fought the proceedings with predictable ferocity, alternating between threats and tears. But Richard had found his voice at last and refused to be silenced again. Their separation sent shockwaves through their social circle, prompting questions that led to more whispered conversations, more careful distances, more quiet exclusions. Lauren found herself caught between parents who had once presented a united front. Melissa demanded loyalty, insisting that Richard had betrayed the family, that his testimony was the ravings of a weak man finally breaking under pressure. Richard offered no demands, only the quiet example of someone who had finally stopped living a lie. For the first time in her life, Lauren could not rely on the manipulation playbook she had inherited. Both sources had failed her simultaneously, and she seemed genuinely lost without their guidance. I observed all of this from a distance, neither celebrating nor mourning. The consequences unfolding were natural results of choices made long before the confrontation in my living room. I had not engineered Lauren's social exile, or Richard's liberation, or Melissa's isolation. I had simply told the truth and allowed it to work. Daniel reached out 6 weeks after the family meeting. His text message was simple, asking if we could talk not at my house or his, but somewhere neutral. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, a place neither of us had ever been free from the weight of memories and associations. He looked older when I saw him, as if the weeks had aged him years. The anxiety that had defined him for so long had transformed into something different, a heaviness that spoke of genuine reckoning rather than fear. We ordered coffee and found a quiet corner, sitting across from each other in silence, until he found the words he had come to speak. "I am not here to make excuses," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "I know what I did. I know how long I let it continue. I know that saying sorry does not begin to cover the damage." He paused, gathering himself. "I have been seeing a therapist, someone who specializes in family dynamics and manipulation. I'm starting to understand things about my marriage, about myself, about the choices I made. It does not excuse anything, but I needed to understand how I became someone who could watch his father be humiliated and say nothing." I listened without interrupting, giving him the space he needed to finish. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he continued. "I do not expect anything, but I needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, what I allowed, what I became. And if you are ever willing to try again, if there is any possibility of rebuilding what I helped destroy, I will spend the rest of my life earning it. However long it takes, whatever it requires." I studied my son's face, searching for the manipulation I had learned to expect, the calculation behind every word. But I found only grief, only the raw pain of a man confronting the worst parts of himself. He was not asking for absolution. He was asking for a chance. Forgiveness is not access. Daniel, I said carefully. I said the same thing to Lauren, and I meant it. I can forgive you for the money. I can forgive you for the silence. Holding on to that anger would only poison me. But trust is different. Trust has to be rebuilt from nothing, brick by brick, over time. And I cannot promise that rebuilding will succeed. I can only promise to leave the possibility open. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. What do I need to do? Show up, I said. Consistently, honestly, without expectation. When you say you will call, call. When you say you will visit, visit. Stop telling me what you think I want to hear and start telling me the truth, even when the truth is difficult. Let me see who you actually are, not who Lauren trained you to pretend to be. Daniel nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. Whatever it takes, Dad. However long it takes. I did not embrace him. I did not promise anything, but I left the door open just a crack. Because Margaret always believed people could change. I owed it to her memory to at least allow for the possibility. The months that followed were unlike any I had experienced in my adult life. For the first time in decades, I woke each morning without obligation to anyone but myself. The realization was disorienting at first, almost frightening. I had spent so long defining myself through service to others, to my clients, to Margaret during her illness, to the hope of maintaining family harmony, that I had forgotten what it meant to simply exist for my own sake. I began with small things. Morning walks that stretched longer as my legs remembered their strength. Books I had been meaning to read for years finally pulled from shelves where they had gathered dust. Meals cooked slowly, savored without rushing to the next appointment or the next crisis. The house that had felt so empty after Margaret's death began to transform. It was still quiet, still marked by her absence in every room. But the silence had changed quality. It no longer echoed with loss. It hummed with possibility. I traveled to places Margaret and I had always planned to visit but never found the time. The coast of Maine, where she had dreamed of watching lobster boats return at sunset. The mountains of New Mexico, where she had wanted to see the light that artists had been chasing for centuries. Each destination carried a bittersweet weight, the joy of finally arriving, mixed with grief that she was not beside me. But I found myself talking to her anyway, pointing out sights she would have loved, imagining her reactions, keeping her present in the only way still available to me. Old friendships neglected during the years of caregiving and family drama began to revive. College roommates I had not seen in decades responded to tentative emails with enthusiasm. Former colleagues welcomed me back into circles I had quietly withdrawn from. I discovered that the isolation I had experienced was largely self-imposed, a consequence of prioritizing people who did not value me over people who genuinely did. The correction was simple, almost embarrassingly so. I stopped reaching toward those who pushed me away and started reaching toward those who had been waiting all along. The most unexpected friendship emerged from the wreckage of the Lawson family. Richard called me one afternoon, his voice tentative, asking if I might be willing to meet for coffee. I agreed without hesitation. The man who had stood up in my living room and chosen truth over blood had earned at least that much. Our first conversation was awkward, two strangers bound by circumstance searching for common ground. But as the coffee cooled and the words came easier, I realized we were not strangers at all. We were mirror images, men who had lived too long in silence, who had watched manipulation consume our families, who had finally found the courage to speak when staying silent became more painful than the consequences of truth. Richard was rebuilding his life at 62, learning to make decisions without Melissa's voice in his head, rediscovering preferences and opinions that had been suppressed for 3 decades. I was rediscovering my own life at 67, reclaiming space that had been colonized by people who saw me only as a resource. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became regular meetings. Richard and I developed a friendship built on mutual understanding that required no explanation. When he struggled with guilt over the years he had stayed silent, I understood without judgment. When I wrestled with anger that still surfaced unexpectedly, he listened without trying to fix it. We were both works in progress, both learning that healing is not a destination but a direction. The idea for the foundation came to me during one of our dinners. Richard was describing a cousin who had recently discovered that her own children had been systematically draining her retirement accounts. The story was depressingly familiar, another variation on the pattern we both knew too well. As I listened, something crystallized in my mind. My experience with Lauren and the Lawsons was not unique. It was not even unusual. Elder financial exploitation was epidemic, hidden behind closed doors, and family loyalty protected by the same shame and silence that had kept Richard trapped for 30 years. I could do something about that. The Margaret Whitman Foundation launched 6 months later, funded by resources I had once worried about protecting from those who would exploit them. The mission was simple: education, legal support, and advocacy for elderly victims of family financial exploitation. Evelyn joined the board, bringing her legal expertise and her personal connection to Margaret's memory. Richard volunteered his time, finding purpose in helping others escape the patterns that had imprisoned him. The work was meaningful in ways I had not anticipated. Each person I spoke with, each story I heard, reinforced the importance of what Margaret had understood so clearly. Kindness without boundaries was an invitation to be used. Protection was not selfishness. Speaking the truth was not betrayal. These lessons, learned so painfully in my own life, became tools I could offer to others who were still trapped in confusion and guilt. The Foundation's first public event drew a modest crowd, mostly people who had been touched by the issue personally. I stood at the podium and looked out at faces that mirrored my own journey, some still raw with recent wounds, others further along the path of recovery. I had prepared remarks, careful words vetted by communications professionals, but when I opened my mouth, something simpler came out. I did not need revenge, I told them. I needed purpose. And sometimes purpose is simply refusing to let what happened to you happen to someone else. In the front row, Richard nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. Beside him sat Evelyn, guardian of Margaret's final gifts, and behind them at the end of a row sat an empty chair I had reserved for Daniel. He had not come. He was not ready. Or perhaps I was not ready. The invitation had been sent regardless. The chair remained empty throughout my speech. But I left it there anyway. Hope, I had learned, is just patience with a longer timeline. A year after the Foundation's first event, I finally found the courage to organize Margaret's belongings. The task had waited in the back of my mind since her death, too painful to approach, too important to abandon. But time had softened the sharp edges of grief, and I woke one autumn morning knowing I was ready. Her closet still held the faint scent of the perfume she wore, a ghost of presence that made my chest tighten. I worked slowly, sorting through decades of accumulated life, setting aside items for donation, keeping treasures too precious to release. A sweater she wore on our anniversary trips. The reading glasses she could never find. A jewelry box filled with pieces that held stories only we knew. In the bottom drawer of her desk, I found a folder I had not noticed before. It contained photographs, dozens of them printed from digital files and organized by date. Margaret had always been the family archivist, capturing moments the rest of us let slip past. I sat on the floor and began looking through them, smiling at memories I had nearly forgotten, aching at the sight of her face in frame after frame. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a photograph that stopped my breath. It was the family portrait from the dinner party that had started everything. The humiliating gathering where Lauren had told me to step out of the frame. I stared at the image, confused by its presence in Margaret's collection. She had died 2 years before that dinner. How could she possibly have a copy of this photograph? Then I looked more closely and realized I was wrong. This was not the photograph from that recent dinner. This was an older image, similar in composition but different in details. The clothing was from years ago. Daniel looked younger, and Margaret herself stood in the frame, positioned near the edge of the group. The metadata printed on the back of the photo confirmed what I was beginning to understand. The date matched exactly with the recording Evelyn had given me. Margaret had taken this photograph on the same day she recorded her conversation with Lauren. The same afternoon, perhaps within hours of hearing my daughter-in-law casually discuss waiting for my death. I examined the image with new eyes, searching for details I had missed in countless earlier viewings. The composition was similar to so many family portraits, everyone arranged in the living room, smiles directed toward the camera. Richard and Melissa stood in their usual positions of prominence. Daniel smiled, the uncertain smile I now recognized as anxiety rather than happiness. Lauren beamed at the center of the frame, radiant with the confidence of someone who believed she was winning. But Margaret was not smiling. While everyone else performed for the camera, my wife stood at the edge of the group with an expression I could now identify precisely. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was not even disappointment. It was knowing. She looked directly at Lauren with eyes that saw through every layer of charm and manipulation to the predator beneath. She had captured the truth in a single frame, preserving evidence of what she had just learned, creating a record that would outlast her own life. I held the photograph for a long time, tracing her face with my fingertip, understanding at last the full scope of what she had done. Margaret had not simply recorded a conversation and hoped for the best, she had documented everything. The recording, the photograph, the sealed envelope with instructions for Evelyn, the protective clauses in our trust. All of it was part of a coordinated defense she had constructed in her final months. She had known she was dying. She had known I would eventually face this threat alone, and she had spent her remaining energy building me a fortress I did not even know existed. 3 weeks after I discovered the photograph, a message reached me through intermediaries. Lauren had heard about my find, presumably through Daniel, and she wanted something from me for the first time since our confrontation. She wanted all copies of that photograph destroyed. The message was longer than it needed to be, filled with justifications and appeals that I skimmed without fully absorbing. But one passage caught my attention and stayed with me. Every time I see that picture Lauren had written, I see her eyes. Margaret. She is always watching. Even in photographs from years ago, she is always watching. I cannot escape it. I cannot forget it. She knew what I was, and she made sure everyone would eventually see it too. I did not respond. Some things do not require an answer. The photograph remained in my possession not as a weapon, but as a testament. Margaret had seen the truth before any of us were willing to acknowledge it. She had captured that truth in ways that could not be erased or denied, and she had trusted me to eventually find the evidence she left behind. I placed the photograph in a frame and set it on my desk where I could see it every day. Not to remember the humiliation that came later, not to fuel any remaining anger toward Lauren or Daniel or the Lawsons. I kept it to remember Margaret, to honor the woman who loved me enough to fight battles she would never live to see, to remind myself that protection is the highest form of love and that some guardians never truly leave. She spent years trying to erase me from the family portrait. But Margaret had captured the truth years before any of us understood it. Her expression that day was not joy. It was knowledge. It was protection. It was a wife who loved her husband enough to prepare for battles she would not live to fight. That photo did not ruin my face. It revealed hers. And now every time Lauren looks at it, she sees my wife still watching, still knowing, still protecting what she loved. Some guardians never really leave. They just learn to wait. And that is where Arthur's story ends, but the lessons it carries will stay with all of us who listened. What strikes me most about this story is not the revenge itself. It is the patience. Arthur spent decades being kind, being generous, being the father who always showed up, always helped, always forgave. And for years that kindness was mistaken for weakness. Lauren saw a target. The Lawsons saw a resource. Even his own son saw someone who could be silenced with the words, "Let it go, Dad." But here's what they failed to understand. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And the quietest people in the room are often the ones paying the closest attention. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this: kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. You can love your family and still protect yourself. You can forgive someone and still refuse to give them access to your life. These are not contradictions. They are wisdom. For those of you watching who see pieces of your own life in Arthur's journey, you are not alone. Family financial exploitation is more common than most people realize, and it thrives in silence and shame. If someone is pressuring you about money, dismissing your concerns, or making you feel like a burden, pay attention to that feeling. Document what you can. Talk to a lawyer. Talk to someone you trust. You do not have to fight alone. And for those lucky enough to have family members who treat you with genuine respect and love, hold on to them. Call them today. Tell them what they mean to you. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Revenge Room for more stories where karma always finds its way. Remember, the best revenge is not destruction. It is building a life so full of peace and purpose that the people who tried to break you become nothing more than a distant memory. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.